What's the difference between Cardi B suitors and the federal government? Well, class, today we're talking school reopenings, so take out your notes and let's get schooled. We are fresh off back to school season, but instead of being worried about what outfit to wear or if Daniel returned hotter without braces, spoiler, he did. Students had to worry about if their school would reopen, and if it didn't, could they lose funding?
American investment in education is really a promise to students and their families. And if schools aren't going to reopen again, that's breaking that promise. And so why should they receive funds for something they're not going to do?
But I mean, there was this little thing called the coronavirus, right?
Right, this little thing called the coronavirus. You know, the global pandemic that caused 14% unemployment, over 1 million deaths worldwide, and the untimely demise of Quibi. Oh, you thought that was a joke? About the premium subscription service made for big stories and quick bites like this show? Call me Quibi execs. Now, putting aside the fact that the president has no control over about 90% of school district budgets, America's stepmom is right. Students do benefit from being in school. In a letter to parents, she cites research that states students are likely to return this fall with only 2/3 of the gains in reading and less than half the gains in math we would normally expect, also known as an inability to comprehend that last sentence. See, it's expected that students experience some loss of learning after the last day of school, probably because they spend their summers doing stupid things like this. Oof. I miss the days when the most embarrassing thing you'd post online was a cringe away message. See, the curly lines say I'm fun, but the highlight says I'm deep. This expected loss of learning is known as a summer slide, which is represented by the solid lines in this graph. However, because schools closed 3 months earlier due to the pandemic, students are experiencing a longer loss represented by the dotted lines, a phenomenon called the COVID slide, which also could be the name of the line dance these idiots did during a mask-free pandemic party in Brooklyn. Two coughs. And as a teacher myself, I have to say students are not losing learning from a lack of effort from teachers.
What's a picture that you see over here in our number 4? Grayson, go ahead and turn your microphone on for me. Can you get your microphone on?
For some reason, it wasn't working.
Ah, young Grayson. That is all of 2020. See, remote learning is just not as effective as in-person learning, and some families have found their way around that by hiring their own private tutors and creating pandemic pods.
As different families are trying to figure out how to create stable environments, the ones who have the most money and the most resources aren't just creating a stable environment, they're supercharging their child's education.
DeHaas's pod will cost her around $10,000 for the year. Some pods could cost as much as $40,000 per kid.
Yes, $40,000, because it's never too early to teach little Johnny that a good education in America requires a lifetime of debt. And forget about having the resources for a pandemic pod. A report in September noted that in the United States, 4.4 million students still lack consistent access to a computer, and 3.7 million lack internet access, an issue that recently received national attention from California.
In just a week, these two Salinas students have become a viral sensation. Their story touched hearts everywhere. This photo revealed how they did schoolwork, sitting on a sidewalk outside Taco Bell to connect to Wi-Fi.
What? Taco Bell isn't for getting Wi-Fi to get your schoolwork done, although you will get Fios. So yes, schools should reopen, especially for students from low-income families with a lack of resources who also depend on these schools for meals and health services. However, public schools in low-income neighborhoods also need the resources to reopen safely. And currently,
this video shows two men using toilet paper clipped to the end of a yardstick to feel the airflow out of the vents. Today we shared that concern with the mayor, joining inspectors in the Bronx.
It is a matter of making sure there's just consistent airflow coming out of it, and that's actually the way the CDC recommends you test these things as well.
Oh really? CDC recommended? Well, then there's no better time than now to promote the CDC recommended Getting Schooled personal ventilation tester. It works. And why doesn't every school in America have at least an equal amount of resources and funding? Well, there's this old problem we still haven't quite figured out yet.
On the 65th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education last month, students from across New York City gathered in Times Square. They handed out newspapers declaring retire segregation and called for the city's public schools to be integrated.
Yes, like a winning imposter in Among Us, segregation in America stays sliding under the radar. So sus. It's now been 66 years since Brown versus Board of Education, which stated separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Yet today, more than half of the nation's school children are in racially concentrated districts where over 75% of students are either white or non-white. Essentially, American schools today are as racially concentrated as your favorite 90s sitcom. But how do we not integrate schools? Well, last year, we were still debating it.
I did not oppose busing in America. What I opposed is busing ordered by the Department of Education.
I was part of the second class to integrate Berkeley, California public schools.
Because your city council made that decision. It was a local decision.
So that's where the federal government must step in.
The
That's why we have the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. That's why we need to pass
could cut that presidential tension with a Bernie Sanders. And Kamala's right. Unlike the men in Cardi B's life, when it came to integration, the federal government's pullout game was strong. Yep, there it is. So you probably remember Brown versus Board of Education as the decision that integrated schools, but Brown focused on states that had specific Jim Crow laws that segregated schools based on race. However, instead of following Brown and integrating schools quickly, districts took any opportunity to maintain the status quo. It's kind of like when your parents tell you to clean your room and you put one sock in your hamper and just keep playing PS4 as you wallow in your own filth. But racist. What you probably never learned in history class is that 20 years after Brown in 1974, a more conservative Supreme Court issued a ruling in a case called Milliken v. Bradley. Not to be confused with Milton Bradley, which you may recognize for creating your favorite childhood pastime, Trump the Game. Oh yeah, he has a board game, which I imagine is just as harmful to school-aged children as Milliken v. Bradley, where the court decided that it didn't matter if school districts were racially concentrated as long as local and state governments didn't have racist intent when creating the districts. Because we all know that leaving it up to white officials to admit they're racist is a winning strategy. A report by organization EdBuild found that now, more than 40 years later, non-white districts receive about $2,200 less per student than districts that were predominantly white. So apparently, our school system continues to have as much racist intent as a white lady unleashing her dog in a park. And this is because the school district's resources often come down to how wealthy an area is and how much residents pay in taxes. States are supposed to provide extra funding for districts that need it most, but usually don't meet that demand. And you bet this has an impact on resources. Just look at the difference between a predominantly black school and a predominantly white school in the same district in Louisiana.
The mold, the carpet, the walls itself, the classrooms, the teachers, everything that you need in the school or could use in the school is not there. At this point, it's just like a daycare for teenagers.
But 13 miles away, there's another school in the same school district.
So we just tried to film inside Harrisonburg High School, but the superintendent won't let our cameras inside. But there's a clear, notable difference in how the school looks compared to Block High School.
Right, like the difference between these twins. And this disparity in resources has impacted a school's ability to reopen. For example, where I'm from in Dayton, Ohio, the majority black Dunbar High School will not be opening for in-person learning until November 9th. However, just a 15-minute drive away, the predominantly white Oakwood City Schools already has had in-person learning since August 24th, since, thanks to a nonprofit group made of local alumni and parents, they were able to raise $50,000 to buy 150 air purifiers. And maybe it's because I'm Dominican, but I get nervous when white folks care this much about purity. The idea behind integration is that equitable access to resources will happen when students from districts with more resources go to districts lacking resources, because the resources would follow them. However, when they tried to do this just 2 years ago in the Upper West Side,
You're talking about telling an 11-year-old you worked your butt off and you didn't get that, what you needed or wanted. You're telling them you're going to go to a school that's not going to educate you in the same way you've been educated. Life sucks.
Damn, Karen! Sure sounds like separate isn't equal when your kid is involved, but I get it. No one wants to send their child to a school that doesn't have adequate resources. So if it's going to be so difficult to bus students, EdBuild has an interesting solution. Maybe we can actually be busing dollars across a school district border instead. Essentially, US states have to make laws that would give additional funding to school districts based on demonstrated student needs, such as English language learners and special education students, and also provide more funding to districts with low property wealth to offset the resource gap. Which makes sense, because providing more funding to districts that already have ample funding is like giving your unemployment check to real-life supervillain Jeff Bezos. He's just going to use it as a post-it note. But how do we get states to pass laws like this? Well, about a year ago, one state already did.
Both branches of the Massachusetts legislature unanimously passed a bill to level the funding playing field. Dubbed the Student Opportunity Act, it would dole out an additional $1.5 billion in state funding to every district and reformulate how districts receive state money by directing more to those serving more students living in poverty or with language barriers.
Yeah, like regularly sanitizing services, selling to-go cocktails, and casting a black bachelor. This is possible and should have happened sooner. Especially Matt. Dude started his own charity for kids. That is way more impressive than being a pilot. I mean, come on, white America. You may not see color, but can you see accomplishments? Whew. I didn't know I had that in me about The Bachelor. Now, what this North Face ad did not highlight was that the Student Opportunity Act didn't start with good-hearted lawmakers in the State House, but with community organizers on the street.
We organized a broad coalition of educators, parents, students, and other supporters of public education to get the funds our students deserve.
We have had 25 years of testing and accountability, and what we need now is 25 years of full funding for public education.
Woo! Did this woman just ask to speak to the manager of the state of Massachusetts? Respect. Now, the passing of the Student Opportunity Act in Massachusetts is part of a national campaign called Fund Our Future by the labor union American Federation of Teachers that's committed to fighting against the national underfunding of public schools. There are specific campaigns in different states, and you can find out how to support your own state by going to fundourfuture.aft.org. Because ultimately, whether you are pro-teachers unions or pro-Voldemort, I think we agree with school voucher Dolores Umbridge when she said,
American investment in education is really a promise to students and their families.
But when it comes to families in low-income neighborhoods who are unable to join a pandemic pod, can only get internet with a cheesy gordita crunch, attend a school that uses ventilation testers sponsored by Charmin, and, oh yeah, are predominantly Black and Latinx, public schools haven't broken their promise to students and families. The government has. And during a pandemic, that broken promise isn't just about risking a loss of learning, but about risking a loss of lives, especially when children from low-income families are much more likely to become infected than those with the most affluent parents, and children of color are hospitalized at rates 5 to 8 times that of white children. So maybe if America were to invest in public schools the way, I don't know, Quibi invested in its shows, seriously, call me, we'd be better off. Because the way we've been doing it, well,
for some reason, it wasn't working.
And that's class. I'm Chris De La Cruz, and this was Getting Schooled.